Hello there. In this last lesson from our biology unit, we're going to spend a little time looking at the systems that exist within plants. Now, of course, there are a bunch of different types of plants, the simplest of which are these things called mosses, and then ferns are a little more complex. But we're going to focus mostly on seed-bearing plants, which are things like coniferous trees, like the spruce, or flowering trees like this, or flowering plants like this apple tree. So our focus is going to be mostly on the seed-bearing plants like the apple tree. And if you want to learn more about the other types of plants, you can do that on your own. All right, let's go. So to start with, we're going to look at two main systems that occur within flowering plants. And that is the system of the roots, which is below ground, and the system of the shoots that is above ground. So the cells that are within plants have the same requirements as the animals and others in that they need to get nutrients, gases, in order for them to survive. So we're going to look for ways to exchange gases with the environment. We had a respiratory system to do that in animals. We'll need a way to do that with plants as well. Nutrients need to be transported from place to place. A lot of the nutrients of a plant come from the soil, and how is that going to be able to get up to the leaves and the shoots above the ground? So we need a way to do that. And then we need a reproduction system in order to make the next generation of plants as well. So we're going to have a look at ways in which these two systems can make that happen. So the cells in a plant are also organized into tissues that do different jobs. Three main groups of tissues for plants include the dermal tissue. Dermal is kind of like epidermal in animals. It is the outer layer, so the outer layer of the leaves, the outer layer of cells in the stem, the outer layer of cells in the roots. Those are going to be all dermal tissues. Then we have vascular tissues. You can think of these kind of like the veins and arteries of a plant, and this is where things like water and other nutrients can be transported around the plant. And so when you look at a leaf and you see veins, those are vascular tissues. If you take a bite of celery and you see those little strings going up the stalk, those are also vascular tissue. And the vascular tissue of the roots is also very important for transporting things as well. The remaining tissue is just considered to be one group called ground tissue. Basically anything that's not dermal or vascular is going to be ground tissue, and there are different functions of that ground tissue as well, depending on the type of plant and what you're looking at. So let's start with the vascular tissue. Vascular tissue comes in two types, xylem and phloem. And these two types are usually bundled together, strands going up and down the tree, and they actually support the function of either as they go through the life cycle of the plant. The xylem are the first one we're going to look at. These are the tubes that transport water and minerals up from the roots to the upper parts in the shoot system and the leaves. And once they're the right size, they're actually dead. There's no nucleus or anything there. They're just hollow tubes that make a sort of continuous pathway for water and minerals to come up from the roots to the rest of the plant. The other type is the phloem. The phloem are still alive. The cells that make up the phloem are still alive, and they have these sort of porous regions that connect one to the other to form tubes as well. This time, the flow of minerals or nutrients can go in either direction. You can imagine, say, some sugars being made here in the leaves and need to travel the other way down to the root system in order to provide nutrition and energy for those cells to stay alive. So in that case, you'd have a high concentration of sugar up in the leaves, and then they could diffuse from one cell to another through the phloem back down to where it's needed in the roots. Now this can go either way depending on the concentration and needs of the other cells throughout the plant. So it's a way of like sending stuff wherever it's needed based on concentration. And so the content of the phloem could go either direction depending on what is being used and where. The next interesting type of cell in a plant are similar to stem cells in animals, and they're called meristematic cells. It even has the word stem in there. Sounds like a happier version of stem cells. Anyway, so meristem cells or meristematic cells are wherever there's growth in a plant. So at the tips of the growing shoots, you'll definitely find meristematic tissue, and also underground at the tips where the roots may be growing into the soil would be meristematic as well. And so just like the stem cells in an animal, these are undifferentiated cells that after a while, chemical signals cause them to differentiate and become either a ground tissue or dermal tissue or one of the vascular tissues. So let's have a look at the root system now. The roots of a plant, of course, are the parts that go underground, although I found this picture on my phone of one I took that had a really cool root system that had part of it exposed. And so I don't know if this is because of erosion or what, but I thought it looked really cool. So sometimes you'll have a fan type of root system like the one in the picture here, or like this dandelion, which has a taproot, which is the main root that goes straight down, and some little fine hairs that stick off the side. Either way, the root system will be bringing up the water and nutrients through the xylem, and the dermal cells of the root system have this neat function where water can kind of get into the cells, but it's prevented from getting out, and that's what creates some pressure that pushes the water up the stems of up the roots and up the stems of the plant. So that's pretty cool. So roots can also serve as a storage for nutrients like sugars. If you've ever eaten carrots or beets or parsnips, these are all root vegetables where sugars and other minerals are stored underground, and we dig them up and eat them. If you've ever had maple syrup, which is like my all-time favorite plant product, that is the result of stored sugars moving up from the roots, and then collect a little bit of it out of a tap in the tree, and the rest of the sugars go up to where the leaves are being developed in the spring to provide that next generation of leaves for that plant. Alrighty. So moving up the plant, we'll get to the stems. Two main groupings or types of stems that you can see. Ones are they're green, are considered to be herbaceous. Things like celery or most of your vegetable type plants would have herbaceous stems. And then of course there's the woody ones that have the bark and there's no photosynthesis going on there, but it does offer the plant a little more protection to the stems. Doesn't matter the type of stem, there's lots of vascular tissue in there, lots of xylem and phloem carrying stuff up and down the tree. And we use stems for all sorts of things, whether it's eating it like the celery, or cutting it down and making our houses out of it like with wood. If you ever have a bulletin board, has cork on it, that is the bark of a certain type of tree. Sugar comes from sugar cane stalks. Linen comes from a plant as well as a type of fabric. Lots of uses for stems. So now we're going to get to the part of the plant that does the photosynthesis, basically any part that's green, which of course is dominated by the leaves. So the leaves are where you're going to have all those cells with chloroplasts in them that are capturing the sun and turning that energy into sugars. So the way they do that is the leaves need water from the roots, and you don't want to lose all that water. So there's usually a protective coating on the outside of leaves called a cuticle that is kind of waxy that keeps the water in the leaves as much as possible. And then you don't want to steal everything in there. You have these special guard cells that allow for gases to go in and out of the cell as needed. They can open and close depending on the conditions outside and how much water is available to the plant. Once you have the right gases inside, of course, you're going to need some carbon dioxide to do all the photosynthesis, and you're going to want to get rid of the oxygen that's a waste product for that reaction. You're going to make a bunch of sugars, which can then be passed, of course, along to this section of the leaves, which is the vascular tissue, so that sugars can be sent from place to place around the plant so that all cells can be nourished. So photosynthesis, big, important part, of course, of plant life. They can't run around after food, and so they have to make it themselves. So finally, another feature that you've probably noticed on the shoots of plants is the reproductive parts. Flowers if it's a flowering plant, and cones if it's a coniferous plant. And so the flower here is going to make the parts that are needed for making the next generation of plants. So just like with animals, it's going to be sperm and eggs, but the way in which they find each other is a little different because, of course, plants can't move around. And so what happens is that the part that makes sperm is called pollen, and it is formed on the center of this flower that attracts usually an insect of some sort to pick it up. That is a terrible bee drawing. Anyways, the pollen will stick to the pollinator and then transfer to another flower where it will drop off some of that pollen, and that will then fertilize the ovaries, the eggs and the ovaries of the other flower. Basically, the same thing happens with cones. Pollen will be made by one set of cones, not these cones here actually. These are the male cones that make the pollen, and the big ones here, these are the female cones, and the pollen will eventually find its way hopefully into there on the wind and pollinate and create seeds for the next generation of coniferous plant. So both of them require the sperm and eggs to be transferred either by the wind or by an insect or other pollinator so that the next generation can form. Alrighty, I hope that was helpful to you. Take care, we'll talk to you soon.